Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to our Equality, Diversity, Inclusion panel. So I'm shortly going to be joined by 4 panelists. I just wanted to point out that in the underline page it says that we're going to be joined by David Palmer today, but he's unfortunately unavailable. Today we're going to be discussing a topic that probably has affected everyone here, which is the impact of the global pandemic, particularly on research. A really good group of speakers as well. Thank you to Jaya, Sagar, Ravi Kundra, Jorge Barato, and of course Holly Kasky, who have helped organise this all. We're going to be receiving questions rather than through the underlined site. Questions are going to be coming through Slido. This means that you can submit them anonymously and it gives us more moderation capabilities. I'm going to be posting a link in the chat, so you can just follow that and submit your questions, and then you can also vote questions up and down. We're going to be starting by letting everyone introduce themselves and then go through some initial questions, and then we'll come to audience questions in the second hour. So don't worry if your question isn't covered straight away. We'll have a 5-minute break in the middle. Finally, instead of having any slides available on the underlying website, you'll notice that we have a PDF provided with information helpfully provided by Nathan Gunn, who I met with when we were preparing for the panel. We put together a little info sheet on how to support Black students and colleagues. So thank you again to Nathan for meeting with me, and please do take a moment to check that out. So if we can have the panelists, please. Hi, okay, Leah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Leah. I'm a physicist at University College London. I'm a Royal Academy of Engineering Fellow working on quantum sensing and optical sensing, mostly inertial sensors for indoor navigation. At UCL, I ran the Women in Physics group for 3 years, and I'm a member of the Race Equality Steering Group. I'm also the CEO of a startup that I founded last year. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Joe.
Hello everyone, I'm Jo O'Leary. I head the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Strategy team at UK Research and Innovation.
Brilliant. Caroline?
Hello, good afternoon. I hope everyone's enjoying their while they watch this. I'm Caroline. I'm one of the co-founders and the COO of KETS, which is a University of Bristol spin-out company that actually, originated in KET Labs in Bristol. So, we're super excited to be part of this. My role involves mostly people, management, money, finances, resources, all of those kind of things. But I'm a mechanical engineer by background. I've spent much of my working career as a consultant in industry and also in academic research. I've done a lot of research management as well. So I have a fairly broad background and broad interests. And we're trying to build a company that is inclusive and is diverse and is successful. So I'm really interested in that from that perspective.
Great. And Winston?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Winston Morgan. I'm a reader in toxicology and clinical biochemistry, so not physics. But I also do a lot of research on outcomes for both staff and students in research and higher education based on race and ethnicity. I'm also Director of Impact and Innovation for my school, which means I have sort of overall responsibilities amongst other things for outcomes for PhD students and that kind of thing. So I have a lot of roles basically in higher education.
Great, thank you. So I think we should start by talking about basically the diversity aspect of our discussion. So how the pandemic has impacted different groups. For example, we're aware that people with caring responsibilities or a lack of resources to work well from home would have been more impacted by the pandemic over the last year than other groups of people. Winston, could you start us off?
Oh yes, well, yeah, the pandemic has had, it depends what stage of your career you're at. So for example, and also what type of research you're doing. So if you're, for example, a laboratory-based researcher, clearly during the pandemic, you couldn't get into your laboratory because most laboratories would have been closed. And so if you couldn't adapt your research to online, whether it's doing various modeling and that kind of thing, it would be very difficult. So you in a sense had to either stop your research altogether or redesign your project. And sometimes people didn't have that flexibility to do that. and that was quite a challenge. I mean, I could go on, but that's just one of the starting points. The fact that if you're supposed to be in a research environment on a university campus, for example, on a laboratory, and you couldn't get to that, that would be a major disruptor. Yeah. I want to start there, and I can come back with other points. But that was the main thing I found for both my colleagues and for my PhD students who were trying to work. They couldn't get into the lab, and the software, whatever it was, wasn't always available for them to sort of model what they were doing from home. If they had the equipment, for example, the hardware at home, because sometimes it's not just an ordinary PC you might need, or you might need the software. And whereas you might have this access to the software on campus, you may not have the license to take it home. All those kind of things would have impacted on people doing research. You're on mute.
Sorry, Joe, could you add, are there any other groups that you think have been particularly impacted over the past year?
Yes, I think the impacts are really different and varied for many people. So it could be that you have caring responsibilities, or you perhaps have a disability or a long-term health condition, so you've been shielding. You might be looking after relatives, your work may have been disrupted, as Winston has said. So I think there's a whole stack of different reasons and impacts on people. I think some of the things that we're interested in is kind of how this looks in the future. So what does it mean as people continue with their careers? So how do we make assessments of your contributions? How does that change over time? What does it look like in terms of equality and diversity as we move forward? So are different groups affected in different ways? I think there's also impact on different types of research. So it might be that if you are a field researcher, for example, then you haven't been able to travel and do your field research. Again, as Winston said, you haven't had access to labs, perhaps, or software or hardware. And then I think for some people, the pandemic has been positive for their working environment because they've been able to demonstrate that they can work remotely. And for some people, that's been an advantage. So I think it's going to take us a while to unpick really what the impact is. And it will be different for different people. And we should remember that as we move out of the pandemic and back into different ways of working in the future.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think there's any predictions that we can make about how the pandemic will affect diversity in academia in general moving forwards?
So I think that's a really difficult question to answer because we're dealing with such varied populations, and I think it's quite hard to generalize at this stage. So we know from the early stages of the pandemic that there were reports about the publications people were submitting, or manuscripts people were submitting for publication, and changes there. We've been looking, as a funder of research and innovation, we've been looking at our grant application data as well. And we're not ready to publish that yet, but I think that will again give us some indicators of the impact. But that's just the short-term impact. I think we will be feeling the impact of this for a long time to come. And it might be that what we really need to be doing is thinking about how we work differently in the future to minimise the effects, rather than kind of trying to just revert back to the way that we worked in 2019.
Yeah, I agree. Leah or Caroline, do you have anything to add?
So I think from my point of view as an early career researcher, so I don't have a permanent contract anywhere. And I am also someone who relies on access to labs. I'm an experimentalist. So I haven't had access for a full year, and I probably still won't for another month, because UCL is in central London and there's all these additional issues with the density of population, you know, around Tottenham Court Road, Oxford Circus and stuff. So I know there's massive differences, both geographical, but also institution based as well. To me, I think we're definitely going to see something in statistics over the next 5 years. I think access to funding or access to resources that allow you to flourish has been really tough, and it's not an equal spread as well. So, for example, there's been promotion freezes at various universities, and we'll see that effect in a few years' time. I'm pretty certain, I'm almost willing to bet on this, that the inequalities that we currently see, and there are huge inequalities across gender, race, disability, those will be enhanced and amplified in the next kind of 5 years. That's what I think will happen, just because if you are struggling to get visibility for promotion, or if you're struggling to get anyone else around you to support you for promotion, that will be even more lower over the past year, because everyone's surviving. And there is this thing about survival, especially in academia, where it becomes competitive, and that there is a survivorship bias. You know, people who do make it to the most senior roles, there are lots of studies and experiences that they don't kind of give a support for other people to necessarily be able to follow, or they took a path which is really only visible to certain people. I mean, I noticed that depending on who you spoke to, certain people were allowed preferential access. So when there was kind of occupancy rules, you know, 25% occupancy for access to a building, you'd find that certain people were able to fast track themselves getting permission. And you would sit there and go, well, how do I do that? And it's clearly based on knowing the right people and having that kind of power structure that you know how to play. And absolutely, for minoritized researchers, for people from different ethnic backgrounds, people with disabilities, that ability to just ask someone, hey, how do I get access? How do I get this? That's not easily found. And it's not always, sometimes it's almost hidden in some respects. So I think we'll start to see stuff like that become more enhanced over the next few years as well. So that's just kind of my opinion, but it is hard to kind of figure out how to survive. And I think we have to be really careful that whilst we're trying to survive in academia, that we're not forgetting that, you know, not everyone has an equal chance of doing that.
I know this is a hard question to answer, but is there anything that you would particularly like to see your institution doing to try and mitigate that?
Oh, it's a really tough one. I think it's, I mean, I've got a personal pet peeve around IP at universities and how universities can effectively not take people's intellectual property, but there is some tension around intellectual property and freedom to navigate. So, for example, if you do some research and the university thinks it's really commercially feasible, being able to move your research to another university can become very difficult, because the university wants to keep you, or they don't want another university to get their hands on your research. And to me, I mean, this is something, a much broader conversation that, isn't really for this scope, but there's something around allowing researchers to own their research. Because as a researcher, I've spent over 10 years at UCL. My fellowship finishes at the end of this year. At the end of that year, I have to give back all my equipment, my laptops, everything. So when I come out of that position, I'm left with nothing, because my publications get taken by ref. So I can't even bring my publications to another university. I don't have equipment. I don't have PhD students. Don't even have access to journals, if I leave a university. And so does that then make me not a scientist anymore? It's really those questions about agency and freedom of working on science, I think, would maybe allow for more collaboration, more supportive networks to come in, so you don't have that competition vibe, at least from an institutional point of view. But whether we can solve the competition element between one another, I mean, that's a whole societal and cultural thing for us to work on. But I feel like there could be something around, the way that the work that we do is seen and valued, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Caroline, I imagine you must have quite a different perspective coming from industry, particularly as a startup. How do you think that the pandemic has affected you differently to academia, if that's an easy comparison to make?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that actually as Leah was speaking. It is quite different in a startup, and it's probably quite different also if you're in a bigger corporate institution as well. You know, a university isn't necessarily the most nurturing environment in which to work, and your experience of it will be very much down to the individual group that you work with, whether that be your supervisor or your research team or your school or whatever. And so people will have had a different experience based on that, and we know that it's really competitive, and that in itself will have made things more difficult. In a startup, everything is uncertain all of the time. You know, it's uncertain from day one. So in many ways, you'd think startups would be best placed to deal with something like the pandemic, because you're dealing with change every day, and it's just a case of, you know, is it linear change or is it exponential and crazy at the time? And so in many ways, dealing with something being thrown at us from one side was kind of business as usual in many ways, but obviously quite extreme business as usual. And we were able to kind of look at what we were doing, adjust, make a plan and crack on, and sort of it almost was to be expected. I also think that because we're a small company, we can look at individuals and say, what do you need to get your job done? What do you need from us to support you in doing that? And how might we now adjust in order for you to be able to do your job most effectively? And I think probably that's much harder in a bigger institution, but you are relying really on your leaders to do that for you. And they should be able to a certain extent, say to you, whether that be Leah or some other researcher, look, you know, you're out of the building. What can I do to support you? How can we change what you're doing so that you're still learning, you're still developing, you're still creating new knowledge, which of course is your job, but you're doing it in a new environment and new circumstances. And why weren't we doing that before anyway? Because that's leadership. That's what we should be doing all the time. So the pandemic in many ways shouldn't have changed that. We should always be looking to do what our people need in order to do their best work. So possibly startups were okay to deal with the change. There's the money part, of course, and startups don't have a lot of that often. There's not much kind of in the distance that says, well, we'll be all right, we'll hunker down for a couple of years and then we'll get back on track. You know, that's not going to happen in a startup. You know, you can see the horizon kind of looming and you have to deal with the finances. So for us, in many ways, dealing with that, the financial impact of not making progress was probably bigger than dealing with any kind of personal circumstances that we can accommodate because we're small and innovative, and that's what we do.
Yeah, Winston.
Yeah, so just finishing off what Caroline just said about startups. I mean, we have a few SMEs who've just literally had started just before the pandemic at our university. And the pandemic was really, and the fact that we had to lock down really impacted them quite significantly. Because if you imagine, these are smaller companies who are just starting out, so they didn't have the financial resources or the access to be able to continue. So, you know, they had only a small number of staff, but these had to be furloughed. So that was a really big impact that no one had sort of considered, because we were just going into this new direction of having small startup companies. But going back to the impact of the pandemic generally, now that I've got my brain sort of a bit more in sync, I'm just thinking, first of all, if you think of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on different groups, sort of different racialized groups, one of the things that, you know, you would have seen that having a psychological effect on the students, for example, but also the researchers, because if you're from a group that's more affected by the pandemic or by the virus, as how you thought, either whatever the reasons are, how you respond to it, whether you want to be on campus or whether you want to be at home, would be different when you want to, because now we're having students coming back. And we are still, you know, some students are more reluctant to come back because, as Leah said, it's still not quite certain whether things are safe if you're going to go into an area where it's really crowded. So those things, and because we haven't really addressed the disproportionate impact, that's still a problem. We also have to think of the pandemic. It occurred at a time, a sort of crucial time, if you like, in the world's view of racial inequality and things like we had the George Floyd thing and the Black Lives Matter, and that also sort of coincided with the pandemic. So it's given us an opportunity to review how we see things, and what we can see is there's definitely more emphasis on things like race equality and equal representation and that kind of thing, which hasn't happened before. But generally, this is like a window that we all have to jump on really quickly, otherwise you can see it disappearing. I have a colleague, both a colleague and I, we're both quote unquote senior scientists, but we both agree that we have never been so visible until the pandemic. We're biological scientists, so people are interested in our views. He's an immunologist, a toxicologist, and so we can talk about the virus and the vaccine and development and that kind of thing. And we've been very visible, and so we have to sort of jump on this opportunity, but we can see that opportunity disappearing. The other thing that the pandemic has done is, again, another colleague mentioned the impact on the economics of universities and organizations generally, is that some organizations have to lose staff. And the process historically, when you lose staff, it tends to be those who are perhaps on fixed-term contracts. And they tend to be, again, people from groups described as Black, Asian and minority ethnic. So they tend to be the first to go. Or those people who have, because whenever you lose staff, it's going to be who advocates for you to remain. And clearly, the more allies you have in an organization, especially at the center of the organization, the more likely you are to stay. Whereas if you don't have allies, when it's time to cut a budget, people will look the other way for some people and look, say, right, that person can go. So there are those issues. And finally, just to, what the pandemic does, it really stresses our society and our organization and our institutions. And what we see then are the fallout. So anyone who's vulnerable is more likely to be affected compared to anyone who's, people who are, if you like, secure and safe in the system. I hope that's a bit more to go on with.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think I'm going to ask a similar question, which I know isn't always easy to answer, but in terms of a lot of our audience are going to be academics. Personally, what can they do? How can they change their behavior to try and mitigate this rather than just seeing the problem?
Is that to me or to who?
Yeah, to you or anyone else as well who'd be going to answer.
Oh yeah, well, I suppose academics have to be, it's in a sense it's a wake up call for academics to actually sort of look at your students in a way that you probably hadn't done so before, in terms of their real lives and the fact that it's one of those things where, for example, academics say they're colorblind, and so they see everyone as the same, but the reality is there are differences and people are affected differently. So academics have to see that some students are going to be affected, as I said, or colleagues are going to be affected in different ways, and you have to acknowledge that and sort of change your behavior. So that's one thing academics can do to start with. Yeah. I don't know if any other colleague has anything else to say on this.
Yeah, Leah.
Yeah, I'll add something. I think something which is really hard to do, but I think it's good for everyone to do it, is to kind of look around your immediate circle, look at the collaborations that you're involved in, look, when you go to seminars or conferences, look at the people who attend and the groups that you're in, and think about who's being left out. And it's always, I think, the best way to think about it is people are being actively left out. It's not that people aren't good enough to attend conferences or to be involved. It's never that. Let me reassure everyone that undergraduate kind of statistics do show fantastic representation, especially among ethnic minorities. And immediately after the undergraduate for science subjects, that decreases and decreases and decreases. So it's never a case of people don't have ability, but it's that people aren't actively being invited. And so if you're in those spaces, you can start bridging that active engagement. And I know that's really difficult when you're a bit more junior, like a PhD student, but it can be as simple as just being aware, making your own network. This is what I used to do before I had any power, and I probably still don't really have that much power, but I have a little bit of funding now to distribute to people. I used to just be like, well, I can't offer people anything apart from my friendship, my support, and my professionalism in terms of, paying attention to what their work is, having a catch up once a year or something, and seeing them as actual scientists and plotting on how you're going to invite them into the scenario later, or how you can work together to equally. So that's what I tend to do, is we tend to equally bid as co-PIs on something later, so that we're starting something between us. So sometimes you don't necessarily want to invite people into existing groups where they may not be treated very well. You know, sometimes it's up to you to come up with a new initiative where you have co-ownership with other researchers who don't get invited to these things often, and also listening. I mean, you know, I can't remember what the quote is, but it was like, you know, you're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. That's because, you know, listening is something which doesn't take any effort whatsoever, but it's just that patient type of listening where you may have to adjust your initial reactions to things. And this is something that I still have to do, because I grew up in the UK as like one of the only Chinese kids in the school, and I took on a lot of societal weird toxic things, and so every now and again I have to kind of in my head be like, okay, no, think that through again, and really think about like why that thought popped up in your head. And I still get this around me being a woman, how I should operate in spaces. And I sometimes have to give myself a pep talk that I don't have to perform a certain way to fit into certain groups and stuff like that, but also double thinking that with how I engage with other people and whether they feel a pressure to be a certain way around me. And really the best way of describing it is, you know, we're humans, and it's up to us to try and be humane in how we engage with people. And it's very easy for competitiveness or for like career stuff to overshadow that. The realization that career and the academic mentality is kind of built on a framework that naturally has quite a lot of problematic things from society. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You touched on something that I think we could discuss as well, which is especially in academia, I think there's a different mindset potentially, and I think academics have been affected by the pandemic very differently than quite a lot of other sectors. Could we talk about how I think the academic mindset and the culture in academia has either perpetuated or maybe mitigated some of the issues that have come up over the last year? Perhaps Winston, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, but before that, can I go back and just to add to what can academics do? And it's sort of linked to something that someone in Joe's position can do. For example, is that at the moment, yeah, when someone applies for a grant, either, you know, and they put in their sort of information as well as their institution's information, I think there should be more emphasis on their EDI record in terms of how they employ people and how many people they work with from protected characteristics, which they don't have, in a sense, they don't really have to emphasize. All it's about the project, which is a good thing. But perhaps also, if we want to get more people who are traditionally excluded from sort of doing sort of like research at the top places, then one of the ways you can do that is by insisting that anyone who's going to be awarded a grant, you know, really sort of not just the sort of superficial stuff, but really show how they've sort of employed people from those groups which are underrepresented, and not the broader BAME group sometimes, because you can find that might be by including all BAME, you can cover up serious deficiencies in certain areas. So it's really important that people don't say, right, we have, I don't know, 30% BAME in our department, but when you look at it, they've never seen perhaps someone, you know, from an African background ever in their laboratory, but they still have 30% BAME. So that kind of thing would be quite useful to do in terms of what academics and senior people in sort of awarding funding for research can do. And I've totally, I have to confess, forgotten your question. I don't know if that was deliberate, so I didn't have to answer it, but I don't know if you could briefly ask me again.
Hi, sorry, I briefly lost connection, but I'm sure that was great.
No, I said I'd forgotten your question anyway, so I don't know if you wanted to ask me again, because I answered something else.
Yeah, well, following on, although, sorry, I know you mentioned Jaya, I just wondered if maybe if Joe wanted to respond to that briefly before we move on.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're interested in and we're rolling out at the moment is a narrative form CV that allows people to demonstrate the wider contributions that they've made. So there could be opportunities there to talk about leadership, for example. I think leadership in academia and in all sectors is really important, and we should be paying more attention to that. And I guess we have a role as as the biggest public funder of research and innovation to talk about the whole system of research and innovation and how we fit into that with researchers being employed elsewhere, but kind of what can we do to take a systems-wide approach to creating cultures and environments that are healthy for research and innovation. Winston, you just talked about kind of how data can be used to hide particular messages. So we just recently published disaggregated ethnicity data, and that's really important so that we can really see what the true picture is for our applicants and award holders. And then can start to think about how we can target interventions, because you're right, there can be a lot of masking if we aggregate up into kind of binary data characteristics.
Absolutely, thank you. In that case, I'll return to my previous question, which is how the culture in academia perhaps means that the response to the pandemic was different. Especially considering I think probably academia as a sector was affected very differently than other sectors. Leah, this follows on from what you were saying, so if you want to start off.
Okay, so I'll try and talk about it, I guess, in like kind of why I've also got a startup maybe, and so I guess for me, so academia is a really tough area, because I think there's lots of aspects to it which require you to make lots of compromises in your life, if that makes sense. You know, if you're a woman, you may have to delay having kids, or you may have to move your family around quite a lot. You know, I remember talking to someone and they said, oh, you're at UCL, didn't you do your PhD then? And I was like, yep. They were like, oh, that's but that's not very competitive. You stayed at UCL for your PhD and both your fellowships. And I was like, wait, whoa, like, why the judgment? Like, I mean, I feel pretty good that I managed to stay at all in academia. To me, that was the biggest kind of like, I'm here, I'm still doing it. And then to be critiqued as if my roadmap wasn't successful enough or something, you know, I've had that like a few times. And, you know, my choices for staying in London are my choices. Just like no one should, you know, critique whether or not why you changed company or why you didn't take a promotion or something like that. But there's this kind of aspect of judgment in academia of how did you get to where you are? Oh, you did it that way. And as if there's a difference. I mean, the difference is the end goal. You know, I would love to have a permanent position, but I know that the steps from here, from me, to then get a lectureship, that's still like another saga for me. It's not like I've come to the end of the finishing line and I just have one or two things to do. It's still a huge roadmap for me. And after the pandemic and not being able to publish for a full year or do any experiments, I know that my chances are even less likely. And whether people want to say, oh, don't say that, you know, you should still try it. I mean, I think I know the odds, and I'm pretty certain that, you know, for me to try and go through that, and because I think Winston touched on this perfectly, which is it's not just like a logical decision in your brain of I want a permanent position. There's a whole lot of emotion behind that. There's a whole lot of, you know, talking with my partner, thinking about where we're going to live, thinking about how much I want to give up to get that position. It's a hugely emotional and all-encompassing thing to kind of have that idea of I want to be a professor. And for a lot of people, that route is a lot clearer, or they'll never have to worry about being homeless, for example, at the various stages to that. Whereas I have to pay rent, and we live in London, so it's a pretty tough kind of you know, financial situation there. We don't have enough money for me not to be paid for more than a month, I would say. So even hopping off academia to get another job, that's still a risk to me because of the amount of time it will take to search for a job and stuff. And so the reason why I started a company, well, because I got some funding to do it, but over the pandemic, because I was furloughed for 6 months, I basically had nothing I could work on except for the company, because it was the only outlet that I had to kind of not go stir crazy at home. And what I realized from just having that focused time, thinking about the company, thinking about what I wanted it to be, how I wanted it to grow, and the various decisions that were now up to me to be accountable for, it just felt like an ability, a route to get to what I want, which is really to build a team of great researchers and for us to have fun whilst researching. That's it. I don't necessarily want papers. I don't necessarily want millions of pounds. My goal has always been to build a team. I mean, I've worked by myself my entire career because my project is not funded that way. I'm funded by fellowships, not through grants. So I've never had a PhD student. So I'm just a lonely scientist who wants other people. And no matter, I don't care which route it takes to get there. And I've realized that as the CEO, I have full power and control over how I build this up. Yes, fundraising is really difficult and I may not be able to get fundraising, but for the time being, this is what is driving me. This is the alternative that I see to academia. And it's brought back another sense of, I don't know, motivation, and it just reignited something inside me. And so I do see a slight difference in mentality between industry and academia. And in the very kind of narrow remit of startups, a startup is really the ability to design how you want that environment to look like from the very start. And so, whether I'm driven by kind of too ridiculous of aims and it's all going to fail, I mean, so be it. But that's kind of what I see as a really inspiring aspect of kind of taking that risk and making yourself accountable by kind of leading your own startup type thing. I don't know if that answered anything, but I just couldn't think of another way of, because I don't want to just say, academia is toxic.
Yeah, that is interesting.
We all know that.
No, thank you. I mean, congratulations on taking that risk. But does anyone else have anything else to add about their personal experience of the culture in academia and how they think, or necessarily outside of academia, and kind of contrasting it to what you experienced over the past year?
Well, if not, you mustn't let me talk too much, because I will do. But I was just going to say, in Leah's experience again. See, here is someone. The reason she has remained at UCL is because of her hard work. Really, that's enabled her to do that. Because I know lots of people who, like me, I did my PhD at UCL, but a lot of people who do their PhD in a place like that can't stay there. So it's an achievement to be able to stay there, not just for one postdoc, but for two or whatever it is. So that's always an achievement that perhaps sometimes is not recognized. And for someone to actually ask you why you're not there, it's probably someone with privilege who thinks that basically you can just jump from one place to the other at will, when the reality is, and particularly for people who are described as Black, Asian and minority ethnic, you don't always necessarily have that choice to make those decisions. So, if someone has worked hard enough and earned it, then that should be celebrated, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, in that case, I quite return to something we discussed before, which is the necessity of researchers to have to be flexible, particularly over the past year, maybe to change their work quite a lot, maybe even to move slightly laterally in their career in terms of what exactly they're working on, because they haven't had the chance to continue with what they were working on before. I want to talk about how we can avoid penalising those people, because obviously that can have quite an impact on your CV as an academic. Particularly, Joe, I wondered if you had any opinion on that.
Yeah, so I don't have a magic solution for this, but I think there's something really about thinking about the criteria that we use for assessment and how we define excellence. And that's really important. So you have, in academia, there tends to be quite a narrow definition of excellence, and then we try to fit everything into that definition. But really, if we start thinking about kind of the contributions of the team and the broader contributions that we make, so not just publishing papers or patents or forming a startup company, but kind of how do we lead? How do we value leadership? How do we value different roles in the team? I think that's really important. But it needs to not just be focused around securing funding, but what does that look like in terms of reward and recognition within academia, within promotion criteria? How is it built into mentoring and support in organisations? So I think it's a very big question, and certainly something that we really need to pay attention to, because people will have changed their research over the last year in particular. That's not a new thing, because people have changed tack in the past and done different things, but it's been exacerbated in the last year by the pandemic. So it's definitely something we need to pay attention to as part of our work, to think about culture and environments and what we recognise and reward within those environments.
Great, yeah, thank you. Something that originally we had David Palmer on as a mental health specialist, but I think it would be amiss if we didn't really talk about the impact on mental health. So I wondered if any of you could talk about how we can support our colleagues' mental health within the institutions. And if in particular, I'd quite like to know if there's anything within your institution that you think works particularly well during the pandemic to support colleagues. Maybe Caroline?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. These are very individual things. Everybody's needs are different, and the best thing you can do is recognise that everybody's needs are different, and to keep talking to people and finding out if they're okay and what challenges they have, and trying where you can. Although obviously it's been difficult when we've only been speaking to one another over video call, to pick up any signals from people that maybe they're not quite all right, or they're tired that week. They're a bit worn out from whatever's happened at the weekend, and to adjust accordingly and not have the same expectations of everyone every single week that are the same. Just to say to people, actually, if you're feeling a bit crap this week for whatever reason, because homeschooling has been difficult, or you're worried about a family member who's maybe tested positive for COVID or something, then take a break and go deal with that, and don't worry about what's going on here. So I think for me, the biggest thing that we can all do is just treat people as individuals and meet their individual needs. And I think sometimes we go for blanket initiatives across the board, and they don't always work. Of course, easy for me to say when I'm in a small company and we can do that. But it's much harder in a bigger institution. Nonetheless, I think it still comes down to teams and individuals looking out for each other in teams, and saying, look, it's okay if you're not okay, just take a break, go off for the afternoon and sort yourself out, whatever you need. I think that's it.
For me, one of the biggest challenges are for our PhD students, because doing a PhD generally is an unknown. You start a project, you don't know how well it's going to work, but at least you can keep trying different things because you can actually be there. And one of the big challenges, if you like, from a sort of mental health kind of point of view, is that the unknown. Suddenly, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't have the contact you would normally have, perhaps with your supervisor, or as I said before, you couldn't go into the lab because most of the students, well, the vast majority of the students I deal with are either in the lab or they're doing, for example, studies where they need to measure things in people, which is another thing. So you couldn't get, those kind of measurements. So that had a big impact on students, because they have this 3-year period, and you have your life planned out where in 3 years' time I'd finish and I'm going to go X, Y, Z. A lot of students, for example, perhaps if you're in the 2nd or 3rd year, you just got that bit left and you don't know when it's going to finish, and that can really have a big impact on someone's mental health. So what one had to do was always be available for questions and being as honest as possible. And also, one of the things that our university did was to actually say to the students whether they sort of were able to sort of take it on board, because it doesn't really won't necessarily resonate, is that we will be, we'll make sure that all examiners, PhD examiners, realize this kind of sort of background that for want of a better term, the mitigating circumstances. So in terms of examining, it might be slightly different, or what's expected in a thesis, both in terms of the amount of data that might be in it. We have to consider that, all those kind of things, and sort of reassuring students so that you won't be disadvantaged in that way. But even that can be a problem, because then suddenly you're thinking, right, am I going to have a thesis that doesn't compare to someone else in the past? So again, you know, there's just so many things going on. So it's constant reassurance to make sure that people don't feel disadvantaged. But it is a really difficult and challenging thing. And the only thing I said you can do is keep talking and having conversations.
Just quickly add to that. Being a PhD student is hard anyway. Like the second and third year are, you know, you can feel like you're in a pit of doom, even trying to get through that period when no experiments work or no theories work, and it sort of, you know, maybe gets better at the end. If you add to that, well, I'm running out of time and I've got no money on the horizon, even worse. So I think it would be quite interesting to hear from Joe how things have kind of been over in UKRI with respect to things like student funding and how that's been dealt with and what discussions have been had and what communication has happened. Because I think probably PhDs, the biggest impact on PhD students at the minute is not necessarily they've got to slightly divert with their research, it's how am I going to finish in time and will I have any money or not?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I think kind of UKRI has provided substantial additional funding to provide extensions for PhD students. Now, I understand that kind of that has not, it's not the solution for everyone, and it hasn't been a solution for everyone. But there are some kind of, I guess there are difficulties always in kind of balancing the needs of different populations against each other, and that's been some of the work. I think what UKRI has done is it has tried to undertake equality impact assessments and then tried to divert the funds that we have been able to make available to those with the most need. But yes, the impact will be felt across many different types of researchers, including students, PhD students. And I think that one of the things is kind of how we build back out of this. And it is difficult. So what do those criteria look like for assessment? How do we value contributions? How do we support students? How do we support everyone who's in the research and innovation system through what have been unprecedented times?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine that's easy to do. Okay, and I think maybe as a final question for everyone, we could maybe talk about anything that you'd like to bring forward from the pandemic when things kind of quote unquote return to normal. Are there any changes that you've made or any positives that you think in the ways that we've had to adjust which we can keep, or anything that you've learned from the past year? Leah, I suppose.
Well, I really hope that the ability to work from home is retained. I'm a bit sad that some of the really big corporations who kind of were like saying, oh, yeah, remote working, are now kind of clawing back their statements and starting to introduce working in offices again. I really hope that trend doesn't continue and that we retain some balance of options there. Because even for me, you know, there's been certain things, you know, writing business plans and stuff where I do thrive better if I'm at home managing my own space and time. But obviously, you know, I can't do that forever. I need a lab. But having a balance between the two is really the way that I want to see my routine and day-to-day kind of go in the future. So I really hope that ability to do that is there. I also hope that an extension of that is also to have better infrastructure on campus for people with disability. You know, they've shut down campuses for nearly like a whole year and had to, you know, do one-way systems and close various entry points and exits. Imagine if the scope of that effort and the amount of money they spent to do that could be done, but more for allowing accessibility. You know, there's still entire physics departments where if you're in a wheelchair, you won't be able to access the labs in basements and stuff like that. And so I would hope that it's not just, okay, we survived the pandemic and we made made these various changes and we saw how quickly we could do that. I hope it's kind of motivating enough to go, actually, what else can we change on campus to not only just solve an issue of remote access and stuff, but actually more accessibility in general for people. And then the other thing that I hope retains is this sense of planning. So when I've been able to talk to potential collaborators and stuff, because we we weren't sure when lockdowns were going to be lifted or when experiments could happen, we ended up spending a lot more time planning things than usual. Usually it'll be a scramble to get a proposal together or to, figure out something and just learn as we go along. But this time round, I've had some much more detailed conversations with people where we can plan a project, and not just the science of it, but the kind of what benefit does this have for society, kind of a bit more broader than just this is cool science type thing. And also the ability to kind of slow down and think about, who else can we invite into this collaboration, and not just stick with the people that I know at UCL, but actually expand that to other universities as well. Because remote working, it's easy to send someone an email. You're not kind of relying. The way that I used to do this was just kind of walk around a department and just see what interesting experiments are happening. But that's so narrow, if that makes sense. So, being stuck at home gave me that ability to really just look at, international collaborations, who's got the expertise, not just who's closest to me physically, but who else is out there working on this stuff. So I hope that's retained as well, that kind of beyond global boundaries type mentality of what the internet, offers us type thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with your point, especially about people with disabilities. I was thinking that it must be quite disheartening if you've been through a few years of university struggling to gain access, and then suddenly we see that home working really is possible. But yeah, sorry, Jo, is there anything in particular that you think we should bring forward from the past year?
So I think from my personal experience, I've also found working from home to be a positive thing. We have split sites in UKRI, and so actually it's been easier in some respects to bring people together rather than having to travel or not being able to travel and missing out on things. I think some other positives within UKRI, we've had really good communication from our senior leaders in the organisation, so much more open conversations, much more regular communication, and that's a real positive that helps us as an organisation. And then I think we've introduced some initiatives as well that have helped to support people in different ways. So, for example, we have time every day over the lunch period, which is meeting free time and Zoom free time, and we're really encouraged to take a break and move away. And that's something that we didn't really pay attention to when we were based in an office. No one really cared if you sat at your desk and ate your lunch, but now we're kind of really encouraging people to take a break, refresh, and use their time and manage their time to do their job rather than being kind of set by the clock. So those are real positives for me.
Yeah, great. Winston?
Oh, yes. So I think I notice a lot more collaborative working and sharing of responsibilities, and I some of that I'd like to continue because it's sort of people have got to know other colleagues that they wouldn't necessarily have known because of normally you don't go to that campus or whatever where you see them on an online meeting. So that's quite good. Also the visibility, as I said, certain staff have become more visible and that can be a good thing. We want that to continue. The meetings one is a tricky one because I mean I've had days where I start at 9 o'clock and I finish at 5, just meeting after meeting after meeting. Whereas when you're on campus, you could sort of decline to go to a meeting or no one expects you because it's at another campus and it would take you time to travel. Whereas now you can just switch from one to the other. So we don't want to continue that too much, I think, because you can have too many meetings. So there are advantages of them being online, but sometimes disadvantages. No one has an excuse not to be there, and so you end up having too many meetings. So those are some of the things that I think there are good things about what we've learned from pandemic, as well as not so good things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And finally, Caroline.
Yeah, lots of things to take forward, I think. We've kind of moved to a 6 weekly planning cycle, which helps us keep on top of short-term goals as well as, keeping a sight of the long term. And that's been really good. Lots of stuff around people and communication and how people are managed. I mean, I've already spoken about it a little bit, but I think we are all increasingly becoming more self-aware of what we need in order to do our best work, and whether that's deep work, so we need quiet time where we've got to get our head down and do some thinking, or we need time with other humans to brainstorm or actually just chat and interact. And that now we need to be more mindful of thinking about, well, what does my week involve, and how do I structure my week in order to get the most out of that thinking time and the most out of that collaboration time. And I think if we're much more mindful of that, teams and organizations should be more effective. And it's sort of forced us to do that, really, because we're so virtual and we have to kind of connect and try and be as effective as we can on video calls. Then we've kind of been pushed in that direction. But I think that's the right direction in which we should all be pushed anyway. So we've become more mindful of our own needs, but maybe also more mindful of other needs. And that is bound to make things better for all groups and all teams. And everybody's thinking about infrastructure, what IT needs do people have, and all of those sorts of things. But people have already spoken about that. But yeah, that would be my thing to take forward.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Thank you, everyone. So we're going to have a 5-minute break now. We're going to come back at 1:30. Just a reminder, so that questions should be submitted on Slido rather than through Underline. I've put a link in the chat, and so has Holly, which is on the main Underline page. So if you can follow that, and then you can also vote questions up and down, and then we'll meet back here at 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. Jaya's now joined us, and Jaya's going to be helping by introducing questions that have come up from Slido. So just a reminder, you can vote up questions. If you don't see your questions straight away, some of them are going to be moderated. Okay, let's get going. Jaya.
Yeah, hello. So the first question is really like where we left our conversation before going on a break. So there is this question that making STEM conferences virtual and free made Tier 1 science presentations accessible to demographics around the world, otherwise isolated from them. So as these restrictions lift off, how can we ensure and make sure that institutions don't close these channels and Tier 1 science presentations are accessible all around the world? So I guess Joe
So I'm probably not best placed to comment on conferences. I don't know whether Leah or Winston would be better placed to respond to that.
I'm happy to jump in with something, and I would say that you guys who are organising BQIT and other similar things must continue with the way that you're managing them now. That's it, really. That's all it comes down to. Keep doing it.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like the working from home model, and people have seen that it is possible to do. And once you open that box, you can't really close it again. So similarly, I think now that people have seen that we can have wider access to conferences, it's going to be really difficult for someone to say, right, no, you can't have access. There may be sort of cost issues, but generally, I think now that we've shown that these kind of things can work online as well as they can work in person, although it's always nice to go to conferences, I think if that's the question, that kind of access for people who can't get to us is going to be the reality. And we now understand the technology as well and how to use it.
There was a fantastic quantum-based conference called QTurn that was entirely done online, and I was lucky enough to be able to help out just a little bit on them. I mean, the team were fantastic. It was amazing work, and what they did was they had almost 3 different timed sessions to coincide with 3 different time zones around the world, so that it wasn't just primed for, I don't know, Europe kind of time zone or the US time zone, but to ensure that scientists from India, China, South America, anywhere could at least have access within their nice working time hours, so, obviously people were still staying up till 3 a.m. to go to talks, but that there was a diverse array of talks that anyone could attend. And so I thought they did a fantastic job, although that was, a proper committee with a lot of thought and time that went into that. Obviously, all of that needs funding. So I think there's a lot of power in the funders to say we want more of these types of conferences. We need it to be to have a virtual element that allows for anyone around the world to at least have access and to attend. And I think that will quickly drive more of these events. A lot of this type of work is volunteer based. I mean, I would say 99% of great ED&I work is volunteer based, and people that do that who tend to be from the minoritized communities, they don't get paid and stuff. And having recognition of that, or having it become this formal thing of, this is what we want, this is where money goes towards, this is where, I think that will always help on those types of things. The other side of it is, I know the big conferences like SPIE and Cleo. I'm a laser person, so those are the big ones that I know. I'm sure there's plenty of other huge international ones where it's like thousands of people attend. What's been really nice is that they've all been virtual. And so usually if I wanted to go to that conference or do a talk, it's like $3,000, because you've got to pay for plane tickets to go to usually somewhere like California, and then you've got a week that you have to stay in some resort-based place like San Diego, so it's never cheap. And then you've got to feed yourself as well. And they lowered their registration fees because it was virtual, and I thought that was fantastic. I wish they did that more, because sometimes the reason why I can't give a talk is because I can't cover registration fee, travel, and hotel. And so that's not necessarily my problem. Sometimes I get invited and I have to say no because I can't afford to go. And I don't get that recognition then because I don't have the money. And so I think that is a fantastic thing. But the thing I'm a little bit afraid of is that if we progress to kind of hybrid schemes of in-person and virtual, that the people that attend in person will have an extra special experience because of that networking aspect and being able to have dinner with someone and whatever, and people will miss out on that on the virtual one. So if there's a way of making the social or the networking side of things be as equal as possible, that's I think the best balance.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's something that we've had to think about a lot. Organising this conference is assuring that the networking side of it is just as strong virtually, and hopefully that's something that we can maintain with future virtual conferences. Yeah,
and also when I remember when I was a postdoc and I used to go to a lot of conferences, that was one of the things that sort of motivated me and got me excited. Just getting ready to go to a conference, and the idea you'll be going to 2 or 3 conferences a year as a postdoc was one of the perks, because there aren't many perks of being a postdoc, unfortunately. So perhaps I shouldn't say that, but yeah. So going to conferences in interesting places was one of those things. So other computers are falling over. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have another question, Jaya?
Yes, there's another anonymous question. That is, the pandemic affected everyone, but researchers with caring duties, especially with children in school age, found themselves with additional strain in the research activity. How does the researcher funding organizations and universities address this negative impact? And what is the correct way to address it? So if anyone has any insights on it.
Okay, I mean, sorry, me again. No, because I think it also applied to sort of students, both research and sort of undergraduate students, because again, if they're at home, they've got caring responsibility either for their parents or relatives or their own children, and it really impacted on how they could study, for example. They didn't have the time or the space, because if you're doing a lecture, or even something like this, and you're in a smaller house, for example, with lots of people, it's really difficult to have a conversation with your tutors or your colleagues in a way that you'd want to, because for the kind of in the university that I'm at, it's a widening participation institution, and one of the advantages for some students is the fact that they can get away from home and come on campus to study. And if they couldn't do that, they wouldn't be able to be as effective. Similarly, there are going to be people who, as I said before, the only time they can do effective work is when they're on campus, where the university or the organisation provides the facilities. And if the only way you can do your work is if you have those at home and you don't have the space or the hardware, it's not going to happen. So yeah, so organisations really have to think about this more than they perhaps have in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I think we touched on this quite a lot earlier, but kind of what do we value? What are our criteria? How do we measure? How do we measure what people are achieving, and what does that look like? And how do we value different types of contributions? But also recognise that not everyone can make lots of different types of contributions as well. So kind of it's a really complex area, but I think it comes down to kind of how do we create those environments for healthy research and innovation? And that's a big question, but it's something that we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, do you have another question?
Yeah, so the another question is a follow-up from the previous part of the session. It's a question from Dara, and he's asking, he thinks that the idea that academics need to be mobile and move after PhDs, etc., is self-perpetuating, but no one really wants it, like many things in academia. How can we break the cycle? So it's a follow-up on Leah's and Winston's previous points.
Sure, yeah. How do we break the cycle? That's a really tough one, because I think this kind of brings back this element of kind of surviving in academia, and not everyone has the ability to break a cycle or to stand up to the status quo. And for some people, it's dangerous for them to do that, to kind of cause a fuss or be disruptive, if that makes sense. You know, especially when you're a PhD student, you absolutely don't want to kind of, you know, complain a lot or make yourself seem like a troublemaker, if that makes sense. And, you know, fully understand why you may not want that kind of visibility on you. However, if you do feel empowered to kind of break cycles or to not co-opt into behaviors that you don't feel are healthy, the first thing I recommend is building a fantastic network of support around you, whether that's through your friends, family, colleagues. Colleagues sometimes a bit hard to find, but there are amazing academics out there who understand that thought process of, I exist in this ecosystem. It allows me to do the thing I absolutely love doing, science, but there are all these rules of the game that I hate playing or that actively oppress other people. And, you know, and that conundrum of how do I break out of it without putting myself in a vulnerable position or worse, you know, completely, you know, cutting yourself out of that community. You need to talk to people about that. I think there needs to be that kind of trusted group of people you can talk to, and also people that aren't afraid to push back on your thought processes, right? Because sometimes you may be really afraid to make a move, which in the end will have, you know, greater benefit for both your own research and other people, but may in the short term cause you to upset some senior professor who's like big name or something. And sometimes you need that support from people to go, no, you should do it. That person's really toxic. They're not, you know, don't feel like you have to support them. You can be separate to them, that kind of thing. And sometimes you need that motivation to kind of push back against your own insecurities and stuff. There are, in terms of like career-wise and stuff, the way that I guess I'm pushing back on things is that if I can't sustain an academic or research career in London, either through UCL or other opportunities and stuff, then I'm more than happy to get off the train. And, you know, it's taken a long time for me to come up with all the thought processes and also my internal emotions, because the thought of leaving UCL, which I've been there for 10 years, I'm pretty much part of the furniture now, it has an emotional thing for me of like, I'm scared to walk into a new building every day. I don't know where things are, and it sounds really stupid to say out loud, but they're things which can stop you from making that move. And I think the key is to always think about, well, what's the positive that's going to come out of changing things or taking an alternative route. And also this aspect of, you can always return to academia. You know, when I finished my undergraduate degree, I went straight into industry because I didn't think I was good enough to do a PhD. I worked in industry for 2 years, got myself to a point where I felt confident to do a quantum PhD. And it was like, quantum mechanics was like my most scariest subject that I took as an undergrad. And then returned back into academia to do my PhD. And I'm not scared. Like, from doing that, I'm not scared of going out of academia for a few years. And if there's an opportunity to come back and it's for good reasons, then I'm not afraid to come back either. But I know that's really difficult if you drunk the Kool-Aid and you've been in academia your whole life or your whole kind of educational experience. I know that's a really difficult thing for people to imagine, but you can always get back in. It's really kind of thinking about what's good for you, but also making sure that decisions you make don't negatively affect other people as well. Because, you know, being silent does have a complicity about it, if that makes sense. And it's something you have to weigh up each and every time something happens. It's something that, you know, you have to be quite active in thinking about.
Yeah, just to add, the normal model for PhD, especially when I was sort of coming up, for want of a better term, is that, you know, by your mid-20s, you've got your PhD, and so you don't have those sort of like family ties and that kind of thing, and relationship ties, and so you then leave that institution and even that country, because I said it was traditional for you go to North America to do your postdoc, and then you'd spend a few years, you may or you may not come back. Whereas now what I'm finding is lots more PhD students, for example, they're starting their PhD later. And so they've got those family ties and connections. And so they don't want to move country or even more institutions. The problem is the funding. So sometimes the funding organizations, they fund for a PhD and nothing else. You have to then try and get the grant to continue in your place of work. So perhaps, and this has been a discussion for many, many years, how do you actually start that career track kind of process once you've got your PhD, so you don't have to constantly be applying and reapplying and that kind of thing. So that's something perhaps for the funders to think about. How do you make it easier for people who've completed a PhD successfully to remain in their institutions without disrupting their lives, especially if we're talking about people who want to have families and that kind of thing.
Just a quick extra bit for me to add in here. I think when recruiting new academic staff, we're looking a lot for independent research. So we're looking for independent researchers, people who are not necessarily too closely tied to somebody else. And quite often, I suppose, if you're in the same institution that you've done your PhD and your postdoc, then clearly you're going to be tied to someone. So then you kind of got to flip it back around then to established professors and readers and others to say, well, okay, well, when you're working with your PhD students and your postdocs, what you should be helping them become is an independent researcher, so that they can exist on their own 2 feet without you and progress, you know, down that route. And if our recruitment processes allow that to happen, there's a path. I mean, you can't go down a path unless it exists, right? So you have to be able to see that path in front of you. And I think if we kind of create more independent researchers that are not reliant upon their prof because they've got to be last author on their paper, then maybe there's more opportunity to stay where you are and progress. And, you know, it's 15 years ago that I left academia, and that path for me as a postdoc who worked part-time with a child didn't exist. And, you know, I'd like to think it does now, and you can see a way through, but there's more work to be done on creating independent researchers who can follow that path.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I really agree. Should we have another question, Jaya?
Yes, we have a lot of them. So the next question is from Sabine, and she's asking, what measures is UKRI planning to implement to avoid a loss of diversity of people that had caring responsibilities or more challenges to access labs in the post-pandemic world? And if there's a time frame for such ideas.
Joe, if that's something you're able to answer.
Yeah, so I can give you a partial answer, I think. So I think there are different things that we're doing. So we're looking at our data, as I said, and we published our data so we can understand what the landscape looks like and any changes that are happening over time. We also have a responsibility to think about how we assess applications for award and the criteria that we use, how we train our assessors to do those jobs, and think about kind of different career paths and different opportunities that people have had. There may be examples of specific funding opportunities. So, for example, at the moment, Research England and Office for Students are running a call to increase participation of Black and minority ethnic PGR students. So that's a specific targeted type of intervention. And then there are other elements of this that sit outside of the direct control of UKRI. So that could be the recruitment of people into academia, recruitment into PhD programs. So again, it's kind of, we may be able to influence, and there may be some conditions set around kind of training grant awards, but also there's this wider systems-based approach about how do we operate together to create this environment where people are valued and able to flourish in the system.
Can I just jump in? So can I just, because following on from what Joe's just said about how one does that, and she mentioned this new call, and I'm involved in two of those two groups who are trying to bid for funding to increase the number of Black, Asian and minority ethnic PhD students in the system. But I think, had someone asked me, I'd also say it's equally important, not just at the PhD level, but the postdoc level. So I think a lot of equally funding should be available so that we can have more BAME people with PhDs to do postdocs, which I think there's a shortage there, because all you'll have is more people finishing their PhDs and nowhere to go. So you really need to extend that pipeline. So I just wanted to sort of, as I've got you here, Joe, to sort of like, you can sort of feed that up, that might be something that you might want to consider as well.
Yeah, so I think the pipeline is really important, isn't it? And I think, but also recognizing that lots of research and innovation happens outside of academia too. So how do we think about the whole research and innovation system? How do we help people with different career paths? How do we recognize those skills? So Leah, you talked about moving into industry, moving back into academia. So there's things about mobility and porosity in our system that are important as well. So yeah, we look at the whole ecosystem. What are the opportunities, and how do we drive change collectively as a system? And also, kind of, I've kind of noticed a few times, kind of the word toxic has been used about the academic environment. So, kind of, what do we do to change that? You know, if we often talk about inclusion, about kind of using a party type analogy. So, why do we want to invite more people to a party that's not really a very good party? What are we going to do to change the party to make it more welcoming for people? You know, if you're having a bad time, why increase the number of people having a bad time?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's really good to hear that UKRI is considering that type of thing as well. Should we have another question, Jaya?
Yes, so there's another anonymous question, which is, working from home has been very positive in general, but it has also blurred the distinction between home life and work life. Do the panel think there are risks that employers will ultimately expect even more from their employees? So like catching up at home or working even when they're at home. So do you think it would risk that the employers will ultimately expect more?
If they're bad employers, yeah. But hopefully, you know, I mean, Don't work for a bad employer. Someone who does that, you don't want to work for them. You know, the joy of being able to work at home and blend life and work should be seen as a positive. And if I can nip out at my lunchtime to my allotment and water my veggies, you know, that's great for me. And if that means I got to stay around for an extra hour to finish some email because I'm a bit late, then that's up to me to manage. And it's up to me as a leader of a company like that to manage my staff so that they get their work done, but they're not feeling that they need to be online or available at any particular time of day. And that comes down to us as individuals managing people. So if you've got an employer who does that, you don't want to be working for them. So yeah, there is a danger. They're not the people we should be working for. And hopefully those institutions or those companies will not thrive as a result.
Does anyone have anything to add, whether that's a pattern that you've experienced yourself as well? Okay. Sorry, Leah.
I just, in terms of what I've noticed difference-wise between doing startup work and my academic work is the startup work feels like it has an ending, like it has milestones and there's specific deliverables and they're relatively within grasp. You know, if you don't get that deal with this company, then that's it, that's the end of that road or whatever. Whereas in academia, especially research, is endless. There is no way of predicting, is it going to take a year, 2 years, 3 years, or actually maybe you need like an extra £500,000 or stuff like that. And I think that's where it gets really blurry from a personal perspective, where you have a lot of pressure, but also this kind of feeling of I can't just latch on to like a short-term goal and then the next short-term goal. Sometimes it does feel like the research is never ending almost. And I would say that if you're a student in that position, that's not your responsibility. It's really, you should push that pressure back onto your supervisor, because if they're not giving you short-term goals, then they're not chunking up that long-term vision into manageable chunks. You know, you're there to learn how to eventually do that. And, you know, you should contribute to that discussion, but really your supervisor should be the one who sets you those goals. So you're not set up to fail, if that makes sense, and you're not set up to spend all of your time obsessing. Because I know that when I was a PhD student, I was quite obsessive over my experiment because I just wanted it to work. But that was the goal. I want it to work. It was never like, oh, why don't you, get this starting point working, then do this bit. It was just this like overarching, like, I just need anything to work by the end of this. And I was perpetuating my own pressure and making myself like do really desperate, like 12 hours stood trying to align things, knowing that that's not how you work effectively, but without that oversight of the person who's more experienced than you to say, I don't recommend you do that. You'll get too desperate. You'll start making mistakes. You should plan them out in these chunks. This is what I would do. Don't think about the end thing. Think about this thing, stuff like that. So I know you don't always get to choose your boss, if that makes sense, but you should, that's their responsibility. They have a nice, cushy, safe job for a reason. And in a company as well, you should also do that. If you're being set up to fail because you just have to like work hours and hours to do something, you should definitely push back. And then, like Caroline said, also quit if you can't push back. If it's like, oh, this is it or the highway, then no corporation or anything really stays truly loyal, I would say, and they can replace people and stuff like that. So value your time and your expertise, and if you can, get out of that situation.
That quitting thing is quite a good point, because I've been in situations where I shouldn't have, I should have, and I never felt the confidence. So sometimes it just hearing someone say you can actually quit more, because people can get to the situation where they feel, right, I can't quit, I'll never get another job and that kind of thing, I never have alternatives. So sometimes it's worth saying that, although I know people really do feel it's quite distressing. The other thing about working in academia is it is part of the culture. Even before the pandemic, we worked long and hard hours, because the thing about doing research is that it's both a job, but it's also generally a pleasurable thing to do. So you need that management or whatever it is to sort of say, right, you've got to stop. Whereas you just keep, whether you're a PhD student or postdoc, or even you just want to keep going and going and going. So you do need that management culture to say, right, compartmentalize, take some time off. And that is really hard to do. But yeah, it is part of the academic culture. So, and yeah, well before pandemic came along, where people just work extra hours.
I think there's also something about how we model behaviours ourselves. So kind of what signals do we send in the interactions that we're having? How do we interact with different people? How do we signal kind of that we are taking time out and away? Because sometimes that can help create the environment where people feel comfortable in working differently as well. So I think we all have a role to play in changing the cultures and the ways of working.
That's so true. So let's.
Yeah, do you have another question, Jaya?
Yeah, so the next question is for Caroline. If the numbers of people from protected groups are decreasing as they climb the academic ladder, how does this issue impact startup companies when hiring new members? And how can startups help to increase EDI within their own teams?
Yeah, it's really difficult. It's really hard. You put out, if you try and recruit and you use kind of standard processes, you just don't really get anywhere. You have to kind of make a conscious, targeted effort to broaden the diversity of your team. And it's really hard when you first start. We started KETS with my 3 colleagues who are all white males and myself. And we've not improved massively since then, to be honest. We've looked at what we can do in the short term and longer term to kind of try and build some stuff in now that will be with us as we grow, so that we don't grow in the sort of wrong direction, as it were. We've made some commitments as a team to do things better. Chris, our CEO, has become our sort of DEI ambassador and is learning how he can be a better ally, how he can speak in a particular way to encourage more people to talk to us. So there's lots of little things that we're doing to try and improve ourselves as a company, but it's really difficult. If people are spinning out companies from academia where there is little diversity, then there will be little diversity in the companies that are spun out. That's kind of how it is. So it's a complex issue, and there are many variables and many things that we can all do. And we just have to try, I think, with startups like ours, to start from the beginning, to get it right early, and that way it's with us as we grow. So for us, it starts with our board. So if we don't have a diverse board, then it won't propagate. So that's what we're working on at the minute, to try and make sure our board is diverse.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Should we have another question then?
Yeah, so the next question is, the effects of the pandemic are going to be felt for a long time. And so this is an anonymous question I'm reading. I'm concerned that mitigation will end up being a box on an application form or CVs stating that the effects of pandemic, which will then be largely ignored. Do the panel have any ideas for more meaningful approaches to be adopted?
Maybe Joe, you can start us off on that one.
Yeah, I think having a box that says I was affected by the pandemic would be the worst possible outcome. So I really hope that isn't going to be the case, because that doesn't reflect the different impacts that people have experienced and how people have lived and worked through the pandemic situation. So I've kind of mentioned a couple of things about kind of how we're changing our processes. So talked about a little bit about the narrative CV that gives an opportunity for people to be much more descriptive about what they're doing, about what they've done. But I think we also need to think about kind of, as I said, about how research is assessed and evaluated, and what the criteria are that are used for that. So what is our definition of excellence? How do we consider that? And how do we take account of the different contributions that people make? So it's not just about single researchers, but there are team contributions. How do we value those? And how do we take account that people have, for lots and lots of different reasons, people have breaks within their career or periods where they are doing something different. So this it isn't just there isn't a straightforward path through academia, and we need to be more mature in kind of how we make those assessments and recognise the different contributions that people make. And as I said, I think that goes into wider reward and recognition mechanisms as well, within promotion, journal review, kind of criteria that are used for selection processes in recruitment. It's a big challenge, and I think every organisation will be learning how to take account of the impacts of the pandemic as we move forward.
Yeah, I think what you shouldn't see the pandemic as all a negative. So if you've had to take time off and you can't do your normal research, is to make sure that you've done things and you include those in your CV that you wouldn't have done normally. You know, so whether it's attending sort of events like this, you just got to be really creative with that part of that time in your CV when you were not doing the things you normally do. Just make sure you fill it with things that you can also contribute to your CV. But I was reading the question on my other screen, and I saw mitigation, and I thought it said migration, and it's brought me up to something that I wanted to mention. It was the fact that because of the pandemic, I mean, there are quite a few researchers who are going to come to us to do research that couldn't come, and that's had a big impact on them from countries where they can't do the type of research they want to do, or they wanted to use our expertise, and that's been a big challenge. And those colleagues, they have lost out on those opportunities, and for them it's even a bigger impact because they really get these opportunities to do this kind of thing, both in terms of timing but also in terms of funding. So that's a big impact that we're not even talking about, the fact that the pandemic has actually impacted on international scientific travel, particularly, and I said it impacts on people from the less developed world, if you like, coming to places like UK and USA to do research, and they've generally lost those opportunities. So I am hoping that bodies like UKRI and others are going to be able to sort of rejig their funding so that you can actually and put out these bids again so that people can actually reapply for them, and so people can come once the pandemic is over, because there's been a big impact on that.
On the other end of that issue, do you think that to some extent international collaboration can be improved moving forwards by people being more used to virtual work and there being a greater infrastructure for that in place now?
Oh, definitely. If that's to me, yes. We've learned a lot. If you think of those people who are working on vaccine development and how much scientists have really cooperated in a way they've never done before, rather than having this competitive thing, hopefully that will continue post-pandemic, and people will sort of say, right, I'm not always in competition. Even companies, a lot of companies were sort of like deciding, right, I'm not going to do that bit. I'm going to join someone else in the production if I can't do the development. So hopefully we can translate that. I don't know, perhaps I'm being optimistic, but I hope that does come true to at least some extent.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add for that? Or? Okay, in that case, we'll move on to another question.
Oh, before that, I have a follow-up question on this, that there are many students who are doing maybe their undergrads or their masters, like engineering studies, but they literally are completing their degrees without actually getting to go into the lab much. So do you think it would also create a lack of experienced people, or like people with lab skills or experimental skills, when we'll need them in the market after, let's say, a year or two? So what is your take on it?
I'll cut out for a bit, so I don't know if it's to me. If it is to me, I can answer it, but I don't know if it was to me. Would you? Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yeah, it's for you and Caroline. I really want to know.
Oh, okay. No, because we've identified this problem, and what we've done is now that we're coming back onto campus, we're putting on extra summer courses for students to develop skills that they would normally have developed over the last year. So for those students, because not every student, although they've done a science degree, necessarily want to go into practical science, but for those who do, we've offered them the opportunity to come and do some summer sort of like, not quite internships, but sort of sessions where they can actually develop and learn skills that they missed out on. That's how we're doing it at our university.
From a recruitment perspective, you recruit people based on many skills, right? And this is maybe an experimental piece of work that someone's missed in their degree would be a very small bit of that. That you're going to have someone join because they have the right attitude towards learning and all of those things. That means they'll pick up those skills once they get into a lab anyway. So I think probably it's not something that I would suggest students worry too much about. They'll have learned other skills by just working like this in that period. They'll be more resilient. There'll be lots of other things that they've gained that will cancel out what they've lost in terms of experimental skills, I would say. We've worked with a lot of students actually in the past year and a half. We've had a number of interns working on various things, often technical, and they've been able to do it remotely. A couple of whom we've never met in person, but they've managed to deliver really great work. There's 3 students currently working on a project with us as well. So yeah, there's still an opportunity for people to do some really great technical work, whether they've done some experimental stuff or not. So I think I hope that they'd either catch up when they get a job or they've learned other skills in the process.
That's a really helpful answer. So we have another question, that is, rather than considering the ethnicity or gender, shouldn't we look at people as individuals and fund them solely based on their qualifications? Why isn't this the fairest way to hire or fund people? It's an anonymous question, just gotten. Yeah.
I could start. I think the solely based on qualifications, that's the bit which isn't true, if that makes sense, because qualifications, access to qualifications, being able to afford a qualification, those are prerequisites to having that qualification. So the way that we view qualification or the way that we express whether someone's more excellent than someone else, they're usually based around, were you able to access that thing, the qualification, or were you able to afford going to university, for example? The other side of it is, even if we said, oh, let's all promise to only look at metrics and we don't judge people on other things, you can't do that because in society, when you meet someone, unfortunately, the very first thought in your mind will be based on stereotypes, whether that's through TV, through movies, for your family, through where you grew up. People that grow up in different countries will have different little things that they have taken aboard based on what other people around them have said. And I mean, one example is Black men on campus. I know some people who are physicists, and the number of times that they're stopped on campus and the security will ask them, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And they'll say, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm an academic, this is my research lab. And they'll still be questioned. They'll say, oh, let's see some ID. Can you open the door to the lab then? And that doesn't get asked to other people. And just that pure interaction means that those people are constantly aware. You walk around the world and you can't just be like, oh, I'm a scientist, science is so fun. You always have to be alert for that behavior, which has nothing to do with your research or who you are. It's purely based on someone taking one look at you and having prejudice or having stereotypes. And that's really something that we haven't taken into account when we think about promotion and excellence and qualifications and stuff like that. And we also see, statistics will show you that at undergraduate level for all STEM subjects, we have in the UK at least, we have a pretty good representation of ethnic minority scientists and also women scientists. It starts off nearly 50-50 for women and men doing science subjects. And then that number just completely plummets when you get to postdoc. And if you look at professor, it's even worse. I think it's 0.7% of professors in the UK are Black. And that's way under the population, if that makes sense. And you can look at the same thing with funding. So I've looked at EPSEC funding before. And if you're an ethnic minority lead applicant, on average, you will need to write an extra grant to have the same success rate which takes you probably half a year more, but you receive on average £70,000 less than for a white applicant. And that's all balanced to do with the demographics. That's not like comparing it to nothing. It's comparing it to what you'd expect in a population that we have in the UK, and also the population we have within academia. It's not only underrepresented in terms of who has the ability to apply, but it's also even more underrepresented in terms of who in this country could ever see themselves in that position. So it's a tough one, because we would all love it to have a framework that was fair and, as Winston said, colorblind, but it's just not possible. And it just takes one interaction with someone. I mean, so I'm Chinese, and the number of times that when I worked in defense, I would walk into a room and the first question would be, what's your nationality? And it's like, I wouldn't be allowed in this room with my security clearance if I wasn't British, but they see me as Chinese and their first thought is, she's a spy. And, it's like, what can I do about it? That's going to subtly, it's going to mean that if I don't outwardly say, I'm not a spy, I'm British, I might get excluded from their grants. They may not want to use my science because they have that prejudice there. So I hope that was some examples just to kind of convey it happens on so many levels. Yeah.
So can I just jump in there, just because I know I'm always doing this, but what Leah said sort of prompted a question I have for Joe, because about that kind of identity. I know people have done studies where if you send off your CV for certain jobs with certain names, you'll get less callback for interview or whatever. Has the UKRI organisations, if you like, done a similar thing in terms of grant applications? Has anyone ever done that? Or looked at the data for that? I don't know if that kind of study can be done for grant applications.
Yeah, Sorry, I cut across you.
No, go ahead. No, I just wanted to know, has anyone ever done any study like that in terms of grant applications? When people applying with different types of names and seen,
So I'm not aware of studies where people have applied with different types of names. We publish our application and award data, and there isn't parity across from application to award. So one of our responsibilities is, of course, to review our peer review processes and to continually look at those and work to ensure that they are free from bias. There are also kind of other elements of this that sit before application stage as well. So we take our responsibilities very seriously, of course, but what does the environment look like in which people are applying for funding? So are people getting the same access to support and mentoring and guidance so that their applications are as well supported before they even get to the peer review stage? So that's a question. There's also been some work done within UKRI to have anonymous assessment. I don't have the data to show the impact of that yet, but that's another example. So if we take away the identity of the person in a grant application, what difference does that make? Now, of course, you can't do a comparison, but you can start to see kind of do you have parity then from application through to award? There are lots of different variables in this, as others of you have mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why data are important, and sharing the data, because the data don't give you the answers, but they can help you to identify the questions that you might need to ask and where you might need to push and make different types of interventions. But I think the original question was about kind of seeing people as people, and what we need to understand when we're looking at the data is, of course, there's the intersectionality. So it isn't we can't just put people in neat boxes. We all have different characteristics, and we need to think about those in the broadest sense as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you as well, Leah, for your answer. That's a question that I think I've discussed with people quite a lot. And yeah, I think people can easily enough consider that in the past year, experimentalists have had a different experience to a theorist. So why can't we just apply that to other parts of someone's identity in terms of that output? But okay, should we move on to another question, Jaya?
Yeah, so there is this anonymous question, which is the Black Lives Matter movement has been significantly highlighted during the pandemic. We have seen this start important discussions about Bristol. How can we do our part to keep this momentum for change and conversation going at an institutional level? Are there changes those of us with less power can make? Anonymous question.
I can try and step in. So I think one thing is that a lot of these. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. A lot of these conversations have been happening for a really long time. I guess they may have been not necessarily more underground, but they may not have been as visible to other people. So I think something that we can all do, even if you don't have a lot of power, is to really engage with the communities and the groups that have been living this and talking about this for decades, and really kind of asking them, what do they need from you? If you're at a university, I mean, strengthening links between communities, in terms of organizations that are involved with school kids or something like that, strengthening those can be an option. Volunteering your time, mentoring, helping students write application forms for university. There's a whole bunch of that kind of stuff. But I think the key is, and this is what I've seen some universities get wrong, is that they think that they get to start the conversation, and the university maybe wants control of the conversation, without recognizing that erases a lot of work and a lot of really hard work that's already done by the community, whether that's societies, undergraduate societies, charities, nonprofits. Bristol has lots and lots of great nonprofits and charities that work with the university. And I think the biggest risk is to think that us as academics were somehow more enlightened to tackle these problems, and that we don't include communities, and not just academic communities, but the overall community, the local community as well, to understand how we as academics or as an institution can help. I think that's my best response I can come up with. Yeah, I grew up in Bristol, by the way, so I love Bristol, but it has some really awful history to it. It's quite funny because UCL also has pretty horrible history around eugenics. UCL effectively invented and exported eugenics, and so I've always had to coincide with being a part of an institution representing a city or representing an institution that has those historic links. And it's something which you just can't shy away from a little bit. You really do have to understand the origins of these places and the institutions that you're in and stuff.
Briefly, I would say those campaigns, I'm an optimist, I should say. And I like to think that people want to do the right thing, but sometimes they don't know how. And what these campaigns have done is sort of provided the impetus for people to actually find out and ask questions about what they can do and then act on it. So that's what I'm hoping, that when you have a campaign like this, people will sort of hold their hand up and say, I haven't done enough and I need to do more, and what can I do? And I hope that's what's happening at the moment.
Great. Those are great answers. Thank you. Should we have one final question and then we can move to closing remarks?
Yeah, sure. So the next question we have is from Jorge. In a post-pandemic world, and taking into account the different impact people have experienced, which strategies would this panel would like to see their employers adopt?
I think that's a really great final question. Does anyone want to start it off? Joe?
I'll start if you like, because I'm
Sure.
an employer, and I guess my role is to think about these things and how we grow our organisation and what strategies we adopt. So I think one would be a really simple one, which is work is about work output and not time input. So if you get the job done, I don't mind when and where you do it or how. and that's key. And then the other one is to treat individuals as individuals, as I said before, and make sure that they have all the tools they need to get their job done effectively. That's it. I mean, they're my two big ones, I would say.
If no one else has anything to add, I think we have one more question left. So should we move on to that?
Yeah, so the next question is, what is the role of academia in a future of high quality free repositories of virtual lectures?
I suppose that as an academic, I think we provide that kind of extra service that you couldn't get from going online. You might be able to get a lecture free online, but you want to bounce ideas off someone. You want to get that enthusiasm, that feel, and I don't think you can replace that online and repositories and that kind of thing. You really do need real people talking to real people, and it's also dynamic as well. Whereas the things on the repositories or whatever they are, they're static. They give you information. You can't ask them the question. So as long as academics are there to answer questions, I think there will always be a role. These are just additional resources. It's just they just replace the libraries effectively. That's how you must see it. Because even in the libraries, you can say all the information is in the library. Go and read a book in the library, but you don't do that. You still want someone to interpret and help you out with that. So as an academic, I'm not too worried about being made unemployed, partly because perhaps I'm at the wrong stage of the career that it's not going to impact on me so much. But yeah, okay. I hope I've answered that question.
I can add something, I guess. So I think the other part of academia, apart from kind of being in a cohort of other academics, is, accessibility to journals. There's no way as an individual you could afford access to all those journals and stuff. So even if there's a repository of lectures, to be up to date or to look at the history of devices or inventions, access to journals is really critical. And I know there are some websites, which I'm not going to name, but which offer kind of alternative way to access journals and archive and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of getting better. But then it comes this aspect of lab space. It's pretty much impossible for a normal person to be able to play with lasers and do kind of experiments and stuff by themselves. So that kind of lab space and shared space as well, because often when you're an academic, you're sharing lab space before, you can have your own kind of dedicated space as well. And a part of having that kind of lab space and doing kind of hardware work is also that team building, team working side of things, which you start doing that an undergraduate when you do group activities or you do labs with a partner or something. And I think those are quite important skills of how you work together, because I think as we get more into the future, I think this concept of being able to do entire projects with just one person is going to get less and less as an option. It might be an option, but it's kind of aspect of multidisciplinary, across, different countries. That's kind of starting to be more of a thing, and being able to work with people is something that academia does allow for, and provides that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, everyone. This has been really interesting and definitely a lot more kind of positive than I expected it to be. So that's great. I think we'll go around and maybe if there's just one final point that you want to make that you think people should take away from this. So Caroline?
Final point. It's been really great to talk to you guys and hear your views. I think one thing that I will commit to doing more of, and I think that we should be doing as a whole team, is educating ourselves more, as you say, Leah, engaging with local organisations, using our privilege to give back and support people who perhaps don't have the support that we had when we started our careers. So that's probably it.
Thanks. Jaya?
Yes, I think there's a real opportunity for us to build back differently out of the pandemic, and to think about kind of how we create a welcoming community for research and innovation, and really think about the role that we all have to play in that. And that comes down to kind of all of our day-to-day interactions and the decisions that we make. How can we use those to create that welcoming community?
Thanks. Winston?
Right, I'm right in thinking that this is an audience of physicists primarily, and even if it isn't, yeah. So, and physicists will understand, not that I'm a physicist, but will understand the impact of stress, and that's what the pandemic has done. It's sort of stressed our society, our workplaces, everything. And whenever you stress something, you see vulnerabilities and cracks where you wouldn't normally see them. So that's what's happening. And then it's up to us to fill those, if you like, those cracks with new ideas and new ways of thinking. And I think that's beginning to happen. But we have to keep that momentum going so that we don't lose it, and then we don't go back to how we were. We see this as a new start and new opportunities. So that's what I'm hoping, that people are going to sort of change behaviors permanently, not just in response to this short-term pandemic.
Great, thank you. And Leah?
Thank you everyone for inviting me to this panel. I really enjoyed it. Thanks everyone else on the panel as well. It's been absolutely amazing. I guess my kind of closing words is, I think the pandemic was a big wake-up call for everyone. I mean, I don't think you could have gone through the last year and not be affected in some way, whether that's taking away your freedom of movement, access to things, and I think now that we've all experienced this, I think it's good for us to show empathy in that, as the pandemic, kind of the symptoms of the pandemic, kind of are reduced and we're able to go relatively back to normal, that we don't forget that it can be that quick that things are taken from you. It happened that quickly and it affected so many people, and to be aware and cognizant that sometimes this happens to lots of other communities and they don't have a say in it. They can, you can become ill really suddenly, and it can absolutely devastate your whole career and your family life as well. And just kind of holding that, but also kind of emboldening us all to have agency, that we have a part to play in society. I think someone the other day I was talking to, and they were like, oh, imagine if all the academics are really pissed off about the pandemic and about redundancies and job insecurity, if we all during our remote working took a strike for a week, we could have really done something huge, because none of us would be on campus anyway. So it would have been like this extra thing. And of course, that's very difficult to organize, and it's a bit of a kind of a dream scenario, if that makes sense. But I think we all have agency. We all have had to push back on things. We've all had to say to people, oh my God, I'm really stressed. I can't take on another meeting. And I think being able to hold that and being more brave to do that for other reasons in the future, not just because it's a pandemic, but because you are genuinely stressed with workload and stuff, that would be great. And I hope people feel that they are a bit more empowered to be able to push back, because we've all had to push back in various ways over the last year.
Yeah, exactly. Great, thank you so much. Thank you again to all of our panelists, and to Jaya, as well as Holly, Jorge and Ravi for helping organise it. I think we're having a half-hour break now, and then we'll be back at 3 p.m. for the communication session. So thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.